July 14th, 1943. The pine forests around Rastenburg were thick with summer heat and the stench of diesel. Inside a low, windowless hut at the Wolf's Lair, a dozen German generals stood around a table so crowded with maps you could barely see the wood underneath. The pencils in their hands were still sharp. The divisions those pencils pointed to were not. For 3 hours they had argued. A clerk entered with the latest casualty and equipment report from Army Group Center and Army Group South. General Kurt Zeitzler, chief of the Army General Staff, took the folder and skimmed it, his face tightening with each page. Then he did something that froze everyone in the room. He set the papers down, took off his glasses, and said in a flat voice that gave away far more than any outburst, "Mein Herren, Kursk has failed, and with it our last chance to win this war." No one contradicted him. No one had to understand why those men, professionals hardened by years of blood and victory, knew on that hot July day that Kursk had already lost the war. We need to go back a year, back to the hope that hadn't yet curdled into dread. In the summer of 1942, even after the disaster at Moscow, even with the first cracks showing, Germany still believed in the offensive. Stalingrad was meant to cut the Volga. The drive to the Caucasus was meant to seize the Soviet oil that fueled the Red Army. Instead, 6th Army died in a pocket by the Volga. 91,000 men marched into captivity. Army Group A retreated from the Caucasus Mountains with Soviet pressure at its heels. In May 1943, North Africa was gone. Rommel's Africa Corps surrendered along with 250,000 Axis troops. On July 10, 1943, just 5 days into the Kursk offensive, the Allies landed in Sicily. Every one of those generals at Rastenburg knew the calendar better than anyone. Stalingrad in February, Tunisia in May, Sicily in July. Time was turning against them. The plan for Kursk, Operation Citadel, had not been born from strength. It was born from a desperate desire to prove that the German army, the Wehrmacht, still held the initiative somewhere. The Kursk salient jutted westward like a huge bulge in the Soviet line, 150 miles deep, 100 miles wide. The idea was simple on paper. Field Marshal Model's 9th Army would attack from the north, Field Marshal Manstein's forces from the south. They would pinch off the bulge, encircle Soviet forces, and restore a shortened front. Hitler called it the decisive battle of the Eastern Front. His generals knew better. They'd already seen the Soviet response. For months, reconnaissance reports showed something extraordinary. Belts of defenses unlike anything seen before, trenches stretching for hundreds of kilometers. Anti-tank ditches, bunkers, camouflage, and mines, so many mines. So many mines. German engineers estimated that the Red Army had laid over 400,000 anti-tank mines and 500,000 anti-personnel mines around Kursk. Intelligence reports spoke of up to 3,000 kilometers of trenches, 20,000 guns, and close to 1 million Soviet soldiers in the salient and its immediate support. The Wehrmacht would be attacking prepared, layered defenses for the first time since 1941. Manstein and Model argued about timing. Hitler delayed the offensive again and again, waiting for new miracle weapons. Panther tanks, Ferdinand tank destroyers, upgraded Tigers. Each delay gave the Soviets more time to dig, reinforce, and prepare. By the time Citadel finally began, on July 5, 1943, the trap was set. On paper, German numbers looked impressive. Roughly 780,000 men, 2,700 tanks and assault guns, 2,000 aircraft. The Soviets, however, had positioned over 1.3 million men, more than 3,600 tanks, and some 2,800 aircraft in the Kursk sector. And behind the first line of Soviet defenses, there were second and third lines. Behind the units at the front, more armies. On July 5th, German artillery opened up, Stuka sirens screamed. Panzers rolled into minefields and anti-tank belt. The battle that propaganda later called the greatest tank battle in history had begun. By July 11th in the south, Manstein's forces had clawed their way through multiple defensive belts and were approaching Prokhorovka. The two SS Panzer Corps, Das Reich Leibstandart Totenkopf, had battered its way forward at immense cost. On July 12th, Soviet General Rotmistrov launched the Fifth Guards tank army straight at them. What happened at Prokhorovka has been mythologized and distorted for decades, but for the generals in that hut at Rastenburg, only a few facts really mattered. The German spearheads did not break through. Instead, they found themselves in a chaotic, close-range brawl. Soviet T-34s charged into the German formations, negating the long-range advantage of German optics and guns. Dust, smoke, and burning wrecks turned the fields into a metal graveyard. Panthers broke down or burned. Ferdinand tank destroyers, lacking machine guns, were swarmed by Soviet infantry. By the evening of July 13th, what Manstein had promised as a sharp, decisive thrust had bogged down into attrition. And attrition was the one game Germany could not afford to play. That night, Manstein and Kluge were summoned to the Wolf's Lair. The Allied landing in Sicily had pried Hitler's attention from the Eastern Front and split it between two burning theaters. Continue Citadel or send elite divisions, the same SS Panzer units battering at Prokhorovka, to Italy. Hitler hesitated, talked in circles, ranted about cowardly Italians. Finally, he gave what he thought was a compromise. Halt the offensive in the north, let Manstein continue in the south if he thought it feasible. Begin preparations to transfer some panzer divisions west. It was an order that satisfied no one. Manstein, the eternal optimist, argued he could still achieve an operational success around Belgorod if given time. But even he could see the writing on the wall. The Soviets not only held everywhere he attacked, they were building up for their own offensive. And that is what made July 14th the true point of no return. That afternoon, the Rastenburg Conference reviewed the full week's results. Not just Prokhorovka, not just one sector, but the entire operation. Reports from 9th Army in the north showed minimal progress. Model's forces had advanced a few kilometers, nothing more. Mines and artillery had shredded assault units. Casualties were high. Ammunition allotments were already being cut. South of Kursk, Hoth's 4th Panzer Army had likewise suffered heavy losses. One internal report noted that of the roughly 200 Panthers committed, over half were already out of action, many due to mechanical breakdowns, others to Soviet guns. The fancy new armor Hitler had delayed the offensive for was proving unreliable in field condition. The Luftwaffe, once the Wehrmacht's great advantage, was no longer dominant. Soviet fighters were appearing in numbers that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. Fuel shortages meant German pilots flew fewer sorties. And then there were the raw numbers on the green sheets Seitzler held. In the first week of Citadel, several panzer divisions had lost a third of their tanks. Some infantry regiments were down to half strength. A few units had suffered casualty rates approaching 20% in 7 days. On the Soviet side, estimates suggested far higher losses. Thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of men. In 1941, this would have been comforting. In 1943, it was horrifying, because everyone in that hut understood the basic arithmetic. The Soviets could replace those losses. Germany could not. Soviet tank factories at places like Chelyabinsk and Nizhny Tagil were turning out T-34s at a pace German industry, under Allied bombing and material shortages, could no longer match. In 1943, the USSR would build around 24,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. Germany would produce roughly 17,000. In aircraft, the disparity was worse. American and British production, thousands of bombers and fighters every month, freed the Soviets to concentrate on ground attack aircraft and fighters for the Eastern Front. German industry was trying to feed 3 fronts and defend the homeland from bombing raids, all while its raw materials were dwindling. Seitzler knew these numbers. So did Kluge. So did Manstein. So did every staff officer who had ever glanced at an economic briefing. Kursk was not merely a failed offensive. It was proof in blood and wrecked steel that the balance of resources had tipped past the point of no return. The Wehrmacht had committed its best remaining armored forces, its newest technology, and months of preparation to Citadel. And for that effort, it had gained a few kilometers of scorched earth. On July 14th, the generals also saw something else in their reports. Soviet offensive preparation, radio intercepts and reconnaissance flights indicated that massive Red Army formations were assembling north and south of the salient for counterattacks. Operation Kutuzov against the Ural Bulge, and Operation Rumyantsev toward Kharkov and Belgorod. Citadel hadn't weakened the enemy enough to prevent this. It had simply bled Germany white. The math became brutally simple. Germany could no longer choose the time and place of operations in the east. From this point on, the Red Army would. At one point during that July 14th conference, according to post-war accounts, Zeitzler placed his finger on the map just behind the German front line and slowly drew it backward, westward, towards the old 1941 border. "This," he said quietly, "is the only strategy left. Shorten, withdraw, bleed them as we go." It was the strategy of a man who knows he cannot win, only prolong. Hitler rejected it. He would accept withdrawals only when catastrophe made them unavoidable. Each time, he would insist on fortress cities, on holding salients too long, on last stands that consumed division after division. But in that hut, on that day, among officers who had spent their lives studying campaigns and logistics, the shared understanding solidified into certainty. Germany would never again launch a major offensive in the east. There would be local attacks, counterstrokes, fire brigade actions. But the days of sweeping arrows across maps were over. From now on, they would be the ones reacting, not deciding. Some of the men in that room tried afterward to argue that the war could still be turned around by technology. New versions of the Tiger, improved anti-tank weapons, jet aircraft, V-weapons. But even as they spoke, they knew those were comforts for Hitler, not for professionals. Technology could not change coal production. It could not conjure oil out of thin air. It could not make up for factories in Hamburg and the Ruhr being flattened night after night by RAF and Yusuf raid. It could not erase the simple, merciless truth revealed by Kursk. In a long war of attrition, the Reich would always run out of men, tanks, and fuel first. The alternatives they discussed: suing for peace, shifting to a purely defensive strategy, evacuating Italy to shore up the Eastern Front, died before they were fully voiced. Hitler would never agree to making peace with Bolshevik subhumans. He would never voluntarily give up a single fortress. And by 1943, he no longer trusted his generals enough to entertain their pessimism, just as the Japanese admirals in Truk Lagoon would later understand their war was lost, but continue to plan operations they knew couldn't succeed. The German generals at Rastenburg on July 14, 1943, walked out of that conference room carrying two separate realities in their heads. In one, the official one, they would continue to draft operations orders, shuffle divisions, and talk of stabilizing the front. In the other, the one they never wrote down, they knew the war's shape had changed permanently. The drive east had ended. The long, grinding retreat west had begun. Some of them would not live to see the end of that retreat. Zeitzler resigned in 1944, worn down, half-starved from trying to share the soldiers' hardship by cutting his own rations. Clue J died by suicide after being implicated in the July 20th plot. Manstein was dismissed by Hitler in March 1944 after too many arguments about reality. But all of them, in their diaries and post-war interrogations, pointed to the same conclusion. Kursk was not the battle that lost the war in a literal sense. Germany still had millions of men under arms. So, the front lines were still deep in Soviet territory. The factories in the Reich still turned out guns and tanks. Yet the direction of the war, the flow of initiative, the balance of possibility, flipped there, and the men responsible for fighting it knew it. July 14th, 1943 will never be as famous as July 5th, when the guns opened up around Kursk, or July 12th when tanks clashed at Prokhorovka. But in that hot, smoky hut in East Prussia, as the generals studied the numbers and traced retreat lines they weren't yet allowed to order, a different kind of battle ended. The battle over whether Germany could still hope to win. They lost it in silence, with pencils and casualty tables, long before the last panzer rolled back across the Dnieper. And from that day on, every order they wrote, every attack they planned, was haunted by a knowledge they could never speak aloud. The war had already slipped beyond their grasp.